Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The burden beneath the success. Jacob Maxwell had always been a man of quiet resolve. From the outside, he appeared to have it all: wealth, power, and a reputation that few could rival. As the CEO of Maxwell Technologies, a multi-billion-dollar tech empire, he was hailed as a trailblazer in the business world, a man who had single-handedly revolutionized cybersecurity. Yet, beneath the layers of success, accolades, and luxury, there was a weight he carried silently, a burden that no amount of money could lift. Born in the heart of a bustling, working-class neighborhood, Jacob was raised by parents who believed in the transformative power of education and perseverance. His mother, a dedicated nurse who worked long hours at a community hospital, and his father, a passionate schoolteacher, were the cornerstones of his upbringing. They instilled in him the values of discipline, humility, and resilience. "Never let the world define who you are," his father would often say. Yet, as much as his parents tried to shield him from the harsh realities of the world, Jacob couldn't escape the systemic barriers that came with being a young black boy in America. From a young age, Jacob learned that the rules of the game were different for him. Teachers questioned his potential, peers underestimated his abilities, and strangers treated him with suspicion. He vividly remembered the sting of being followed in stores or the humiliation of being stopped by security guards for no reason other than the color of his skin. These experiences left scars, but they also fueled a fire within him. He resolved to rise above the prejudice, not to prove others wrong, but to prove himself right. Jacob's journey to success was a relentless battle against the odds. As a child, he devoured books on technology and innovation, spending hours in the public library while other kids played outside. By high school, he was designing rudimentary software programs and dreaming of a future where technology could bridge gaps rather than deepen divides. His talent earned him a full scholarship to one of the country's most prestigious universities, where he studied computer science. But even there, the challenges persisted. He often felt the unspoken question in the air: does he belong here? Graduating at the top of his class, Jacob entered the tech industry with a vision. He wanted to create something that would not only solve problems, but also challenge the norms of an industry dominated by a select few. His first startup idea, a revolutionary software for data security, was met with skepticism. Investors dismissed him, questioning the viability of his product and, more subtly, his capability as a black entrepreneur. "It's just not the right fit," they would say, their polite words barely masking their biases. But Jacob was undeterred. He poured his savings into his idea, working tirelessly in a small, rented office that doubled as his home. Slowly but surely, his innovation began to gain traction. When a breakthrough deal with a major corporation catapulted his company into the limelight, the tech world could no longer ignore him. Maxwell Technologies became synonymous with cutting-edge solutions, and Jacob's name became a symbol of resilience and ingenuity. Yet, even as his empire grew, Jacob couldn't escape the lingering shadows of prejudice. Business meetings often began with assumptions that he was a junior associate rather than the CEO. Security guards at high-profile events would ask him to wait outside until his identity was confirmed. Despite his wealth, his influence, and his impeccable credentials, there was always a reminder that, to some, he would never truly belong. Success had brought Jacob many things: a sprawling mansion overlooking the Pacific Ocean, a fleet of luxury cars, and the ability to influence global conversations. But it had also come at a cost. The constant pressure to prove himself, the weight of representing an entire community, and the knowledge that his accomplishments were often seen as exceptions rather than the norm left him drained. He yearned for something money couldn't buy: peace. Jacob found solace in the wilderness. Over the years, hiking had become his escape, a way to disconnect from the demands of the corporate world and reconnect with himself. There was something profoundly humbling about being surrounded by towering trees, rugged cliffs, and the vastness of nature. In the wilderness, his wealth and status meant nothing. He was just a man navigating the elements, finding strength in his own resilience. One crisp autumn morning, Jacob set out for a solo hike in the Rocky Mountains, a place he had visited many times before. The trail he chose was challenging but familiar, winding through dense forests and up steep inclines that opened to breathtaking vistas. He carried only the essentials, a backpack with supplies, a map, and a deep sense of determination. As he ascended the mountain, the world below faded into insignificance. The air was fresh and cool, the rustle of leaves and the distant calls of birds his only companions. This was where he felt most alive, away from the judgment, the expectations, and the relentless pace of the life he had built. But as Jacob ventured further into the wilderness, the weather began to shift. Dark clouds gathered ominously overhead, and the wind picked up, howling through the trees. He knew he needed to find shelter, but the nearest outpost was hours away. As the first drops of rain began to fall, he quickened his pace, his mind racing with calculations and contingencies. It wasn't long before the storm intensified. Sheets of rain poured from the sky, drenching him to the bone. The trail became slippery and treacherous, forcing him to slow down and tread carefully. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the jagged peaks that surrounded him. Despite his experience and preparation, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that he was in over his head. Then, disaster struck. As he navigated a narrow, rocky ledge, his foot slipped. He fell, tumbling down a steep slope and landing with a jarring impact. Pain shot through his leg, and he realized with a sinking feeling that he couldn't stand. His ankle was likely broken, and he was miles from help. For the first time in years, Jacob felt truly vulnerable. The man who had conquered boardrooms and built an empire was now stranded and injured in the middle of nowhere, at the mercy of the elements. He reached for his phone, only to discover that there was no signal. His chest tightened with a mix of fear and frustration. Would anyone even find him here? Summoning his strength, Jacob activated the emergency beacon on his GPS device. It was his only hope of being rescued. As he lay there, shivering in the rain, he couldn't help but reflect on the fragility of life. In the grand scheme of things, all his wealth and success seemed insignificant. Here, in the wilderness, he was just a man fighting to survive. Little did Jacob know, his call for help would ignite a chain of events that would test not only his physical endurance, but also the very fabric of his identity. What should have been a straightforward rescue operation would soon become a confrontation with the biases and injustices he had fought against his entire life. This was only the beginning. A call for help ignored. Jacob's emergency beacon blinked weakly through the sheets of rain, a small flicker of hope in the overwhelming darkness of the storm. He leaned against a nearby boulder for support, cradling his injured ankle. The pain was unbearable, and every movement sent sharp jolts through his leg. His clothes were soaked, clinging uncomfortably to his body as the cold gnawed at him. Despite his physical agony, it was the silence that unsettled him most. The wilderness, usually a place of solace, now felt like a vast, indifferent void. He checked his watch, time crawled painfully slow. An hour had passed since he activated the beacon. Surely someone had received the signal, he thought. Emergency rescue teams were trained to respond quickly in these mountains, equipped with helicopters and tracking equipment. He had read about successful rescues in conditions worse than this. But as another half-hour dragged by, hope began to flicker. They must be coming, he assured himself, though doubt gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. To distract himself from the fear creeping into his mind, Jacob thought back to the beginning of the hike. He had planned this trip meticulously, studying maps, checking weather forecasts, and ensuring he had all the essentials. He had even informed his assistant of his plans, emphasizing the need for discretion. Jacob Maxwell, the billionaire tech mogul, had no interest in media attention or dramatic headlines about his retreats into the wilderness. For years, hiking had been his personal sanctuary, a space where he could be just a man, no interviews, no shareholders, and no judgments. Here, his wealth meant nothing. But now, stranded and injured, he couldn't help but wonder if the very isolation he once craved would cost him his life. Far away, at a small regional rescue station, a young dispatcher named Emily Harding stared at the blinking red light on her console. The signal was faint, coming from a GPS device deep in the Rocky Mountains. She immediately identified it as an emergency distress call and logged the coordinates. Protocol dictated that a rescue team be deployed within minutes. "Hey, we've got a distress signal in the Rockies." "Look serious," Emily called to her supervisor, Gary Mitchell, a grizzled man with 2 decades of search and rescue experience. Gary glanced at the screen and frowned. "Any identification on the caller?" "Signal's encrypted," Emily replied. "All I can tell is it's coming from a personal GPS device. Probably a hiker caught in the storm." Gary sighed. Another amateur who thought they could handle the backcountry. He leaned closer to the monitor, eyeing the unfamiliar location. "This storm's bad. Helicopter crews are grounded until visibility improves. We'll have to wait." Emily hesitated. "Wait? If someone's out there with a broken leg or worse, they won't last long in this weather." Gary shrugged. "We don't send out teams blind, Emily. That's how people die." "No name? No extra details? For all we know, it's another prank call or some tech glitch. I'll call it in when the storm passes." "But what if it's real?" Emily pressed, her voice filled with concern. Gary gave her a hard look. "We'll deal with it later. Now get back to your logs." As Gary walked away, Emily stared at the blinking distress signal, her stomach churning. Something about it didn't feel right. She knew the system, knew how often signals were dismissed because dispatchers assumed they were false alarms. But what if this one wasn't? Back on the mountain, Jacob shivered uncontrollably. The temperature had dropped, and his soaked clothes offered little protection against the icy wind. His thoughts began to drift, disoriented by the cold and the exhaustion. "They're not coming," a voice whispered in the back of his mind. "No." He shook his head, forcing the thought away. "They have to be coming. I'm not just anyone. I'm Jacob Maxwell." And yet, even as he repeated the words, they felt hollow. Out here, who he was didn't matter. No one cared about his net worth, his influence, or his achievements. He was just another man in trouble. With every passing moment, doubt turned to frustration. Why hadn't they responded? He had taken every precaution, he carried the latest GPS technology, gear that should have been foolproof. Why would a distress signal be ignored? Then it hit him. What if they don't know who I am? Jacob let out a bitter laugh, the sound harsh in the empty silence of the wilderness. It was absurd, completely absurd, that his identity might influence whether he lived or died. And yet, the thought haunted him. Would rescue teams prioritize someone else, a hiker they deemed more important, someone they didn't assume was a burden or a risk? He recalled moments in his life when his worth had been judged not by his achievements, but by his appearance. Meetings where executives had ignored him until his credentials were presented. Interviews where he had to fight twice as hard to earn half the respect. Even now, stranded on this mountain, the ghost of prejudice loomed over him. At the regional rescue station, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She glanced around to make sure Gary wasn't watching before pulling up the distress signal's location again. The coordinates flashed on her screen, a remote area of the Rockies, far from any established trails. Whoever this is, they're in serious trouble, she thought. She quickly accessed nearby data logs, searching for any additional clues. To her surprise, a faint trace of digital information appeared, an encrypted name tied to the GPS device. Her heart skipped a beat as she decrypted the data. Jacob Maxwell. Emily's eyes widened. "No way," she whispered under her breath. Everyone in the tech world knew Jacob Maxwell. He wasn't just a billionaire, he was a legend. She jumped up, rushing to Gary's office. "Gary, you need to see this." Gary looked up, unimpressed. "What now?" "It's not just any hiker," Emily said, handing him the screen. "It's Jacob Maxwell. Gary frowned, his brow furrowing as he processed the name. The tech guy? Are you sure? Emily nodded. Positive. He activated his emergency beacon hours ago. If we don't send help now, he might not survive. Gary's expression darkened. And how do we know this isn't some publicity stunt? People like him think they're untouchable. I've seen enough rich thrill-seekers play games out there. Emily stared at him in disbelief. You think this is a stunt? His signal's coming from a GPS device in the middle of nowhere during a storm. He could die out there, Gary. Gary grunted. I'm not grounding a crew in this storm for anyone, billionaire or not. He'll have to wait until morning. Emily's blood boiled. The unspoken words hung in the air, he's not worth the risk. On the mountain, Jacob's body trembled uncontrollably, his vision growing hazy. He clutched the emergency beacon tightly, as if holding it would summon help faster. The darkness pressed around him, and his breaths came shallow and quick. Is this how it ends? He wondered bitterly. A man who had conquered the tech world, who had been celebrated on global stages, reduced to nothing more than a statistic, a cautionary tale of a hiker who didn't make it back. His thoughts grew sluggish, and the pain in his ankle began to blur into the general numbness overtaking his body. He couldn't give up. Not like this. But as the storm raged on and no sound of a helicopter pierced the night, Jacob began to lose hope. At the rescue station, Emily paced nervously. She couldn't ignore the weight of the situation. She grabbed her radio and made a decision, one that might cost her job but save a life. Pilot Roger, this is Emily Harding. I need you to prep a helicopter. I'll explain everything in the air. Are you out of your mind, Emily? The storm. Trust me, Emily interrupted. There's no time. A man's life is on the line. And with that, she set into motion a rescue that would challenge everything, the storm, her career, and the unspoken biases that had already cost too much time. The storm and the rescue that almost wasn't. The storm raged on without mercy. The wind screeched like a living thing, whipping through the trees and carrying torrents of rain that lashed at Jacob's already broken body. Night had fully descended now, and the mountains were cloaked in an oppressive darkness that seemed to swallow the world whole. Jacob huddled against the boulder, trying to conserve what little body heat he had left. Every muscle in his body screamed for rest, yet he forced himself to stay awake. He knew what would happen if he closed his eyes. Hypothermia had begun to set in, he could feel it. His body trembled violently, and his fingers had long since gone numb. His breathing came in uneven gasps as his chest tightened under the weight of exhaustion. Stay awake, Jacob, he commanded himself. Stay awake. But it was so hard. Each passing minute felt like an eternity, a test of willpower he wasn't sure he could endure. In his mind, memories began to swirl, fragments of his life flashing before him like scenes from an unfinished film. He thought of his parents, the small house where he had grown up, and the laughter that once echoed in its walls. He remembered his father's proud face on the day he received his scholarship letter, and his mother's tears as she hugged him tightly, whispering, "We always knew you'd do great things, Jacob." Great things. The words hung in his mind like a cruel irony. What did his achievements matter now, here on this mountain where no one could see or care? His thoughts drifted further. He saw himself as a young man, hunched over a second-hand laptop in his first cramped office, pulling all-nighters to perfect the first version of the software that would make him a household name. He remembered the sting of rejection from investors who couldn't look past his appearance or his background. How often had he been told, "You're not what we're looking for"? And yet I proved them wrong, Jacob thought bitterly. But now, stranded and forgotten, he wondered if it had all been worth it. If the world could so easily ignore his cries for help, despite everything he had accomplished, what had all his sacrifices been for? Meanwhile, at the regional rescue station, Emily was taking the biggest risk of her career. She sat in the co-pilot's seat of the helicopter, headset on and eyes fixed on the storm raging beyond the windshield. The pilot, Roger Thompson, was one of the best in the business, a wiry man in his mid-40s with a calm demeanor even in the most dangerous situations. "You're sure about this?" Roger asked, his voice cutting through the static of the radio. Emily nodded. "It's Jacob Maxwell out there, Roger. The billionaire. But that doesn't matter. He's a human being, and he's running out of time. I know the storm's bad, but if we don't at least try, we'll be signing his death certificate." Roger sighed, adjusting the controls as the helicopter lurched through the turbulence. "I hope you know what you're doing, Emily. If we crash, we won't be saving anyone." The storm was worse than either of them had anticipated. The rotor blades struggled against the fierce winds, and sheets of rain battered the windshield, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Every few moments, lightning lit up the sky, illuminating the jagged peaks below them for brief, blinding seconds. Emily's heart pounded as she clutched the armrest. She had grown up in these mountains and knew how unforgiving they could be, especially at night and in a storm like this. But the thought of Jacob Maxwell, alone, injured, and freezing, kept her resolve strong. "Emily, do we have any better coordinates on him?" Roger asked, his hand steady on the controls. Emily quickly checked the GPS monitor she had brought with her. The signal from Jacob's beacon was faint, likely obscured by the mountains, but it was enough to give them a general location. "He's near Deadman's Ridge, just beyond the east slope. If we can get close enough, we should be able to spot him." "Deadman's Ridge?" Roger repeated, grimacing. "That's not a name you want to hear in the middle of a rescue." "I know," Emily replied, swallowing hard. "But we have to keep going." The helicopter bucked violently as a particularly strong gust of wind hit them, and Roger let out a curse under his breath. Emily's knuckles turned white as she gripped the edge of her seat. The storm seemed determined to drive them back, as if the mountains themselves were guarding the man they sought to rescue. "Hold on!" Roger shouted as the helicopter dipped sharply, plummeting for what felt like an eternity before he managed to stabilize it. "I'm giving this one more shot, Emily. If we don't find him soon, we're turning back. I won't risk our lives for a lost cause." Jacob's body was shutting down. He had stopped shivering, which he knew was a bad sign. The numbness had crept into his core now, and the pain in his ankle had dulled to a distant ache. "This is it," he thought. "This is how I go." He looked up into the stormy night sky, raindrops pelting his face. "Is this all I get?" he murmured hoarsely, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. He thought of his parents, of the people who believed in him, of all the dreams he had yet to fulfill. Tears mingled with the rain on his cheeks as he whispered, "I'm sorry." Then, faintly, so faintly he thought he imagined it, he heard a sound. A low, rhythmic thumping, like the beat of a drum. His heart leapt. He turned his head slowly, straining his ears. The sound grew louder. A helicopter. The realization hit him like a lightning bolt, jolting him awake. "They're here." He grabbed the emergency beacon and began waving it weakly above his head, the small red light flashing feebly in the darkness. The helicopter appeared out of the storm, a beacon of hope against the black sky. Its spotlight cut through the rain, sweeping across the rocky landscape in search of him. Jacob tried to shout, but his voice came out as a hoarse croak. He waved the beacon frantically, praying that they would see him. Inside the helicopter, Emily spotted something, a faint red flash in the distance. "Roger, there." "On the ridge," she shouted, pointing. Roger squinted through the rain. "I see him." "Hold on, I'm bringing us in." The helicopter descended slowly, its blades kicking up a whirlwind of rain and debris. Roger maneuvered carefully, fighting the wind as he brought the craft as close to the ridge as possible. Emily grabbed the radio, her voice trembling with urgency. "Jacob Maxwell, this is search and rescue. We're here. Do you copy?" Jacob couldn't hear the words, but he could see the light, and that was enough. He waved the beacon one last time, before collapsing back against the boulder, utterly spent. Emily watched from the window as the spotlight finally landed on Jacob's motionless form. "We've got him," she cried. "He's alive, but we need to move fast." Roger nodded grimly. "We'll hover here. Get the rescue team ready to rappel down." As the helicopter's crew prepared for the perilous descent, Emily leaned back in her seat, her heart pounding. They had found him, but the battle was far from over. Jacob Maxwell was alive for now, but the storm was far from finished, and the fight to bring him back to safety would test them all. Between life and the edge. The helicopter hovered precariously over the jagged ledge of Deadman's Ridge, its blades slicing through the storm-tossed air like a lifeline in an unforgiving world. Wind screamed against the fuselage, rain pounded relentlessly, and visibility remained a near-impossible challenge. Inside, the rescue crew moved with precision, every motion practiced yet filled with tension. Time was their enemy. Jacob lay unmoving against the rock below, the flashing light of his beacon flickering faintly as though it, too, was running out of life. Emily watched through the open door, her stomach clenched as she fought to keep calm. She could barely make out his figure, so still, so fragile, against the dark, rain-slicked mountainside. Lowering the harness now, one of the rescue technicians, Chris, shouted over the roar of the storm. He pulled on his harness, checking the lines as Roger skillfully stabilized the helicopter against the wind. "Be careful, Chris," Emily warned, her voice crackling through the comms. "That ridge is narrow, and the rocks are loose. You've got to bring him up as fast as you can." Chris gave her a thumbs up, his jaw set in concentration as he clipped the harness to the rope. Seconds later, he was descending into the darkness, the thin line swaying dangerously in the fierce winds. Each gust sent the helicopter shuddering, and Emily could feel her pulse racing in her throat. "Talk to me, Chris." "Can you see him?" she called. Chris's voice crackled through the radio. "I see him. He's alive, but it's not good. He's freezing, and I think his leg is busted. I need a few minutes to secure him." "Copy that," Roger replied, sweat beading on his forehead as he fought to hold the helicopter steady. Jacob hovered somewhere between consciousness and oblivion. The cold had taken over completely now, numbing not just his body, but his thoughts. A strange sense of calm had replaced his earlier fear. He wasn't sure if it was acceptance or resignation, but he no longer felt the need to fight. Through the haze, he thought he saw a figure descending toward him, a shadow in the rain, coming closer and closer. He blinked slowly, unsure if he was dreaming. "Is this death?" he wondered faintly. Then, he heard a voice, muffled and distant but real. "Mr. Maxwell. Can you hear me? I'm here to help." The words cut through the fog, and Jacob's eyes fluttered open. A man in bright rescue gear knelt beside him, securing a harness around his torso. "Stay with me," the man said firmly. "We're getting you out of here." Jacob's lips moved, but no sound came out. Chris tightened the straps around Jacob's shoulders, moving quickly but gently. "I've got you, sir. You're safe now." The words brought a flicker of life to Jacob's consciousness. Safe. It was a promise, a lifeline that anchored him to the moment. The harness bit into his chest as Chris signaled the crew above to start pulling them up. Slowly, the rope began to ascend, lifting Jacob's battered body off the unforgiving rocks. Inside the helicopter, Emily's heart pounded as she leaned out, watching the rescue line inch its way upward. The storm fought them at every turn, slamming the helicopter with gusts of wind that made Roger grit his teeth as he fought to hold their position. "Easy, easy," Roger muttered, his hands steady on the controls. "I've got this." Chris and Jacob dangled below, swaying precariously as they climbed higher and higher. The ridge seemed to vanish into the darkness beneath them, the wind tugging at the line like a predator unwilling to give up its prey. "Almost there," Chris shouted, his voice strained through the comms. Emily's eyes widened as she noticed the rope jerking sharply. "Chris, the wind's pulling you too far to the left. Hang on." Roger cursed under his breath as the helicopter lurched, dipping dangerously to one side. "I can't hold it much longer." Tell them to hurry. Chris wrapped one arm tightly around Jacob, shielding him from the elements. Pull us faster, he screamed into his radio. The crew in the helicopter scrambled to reel them in, their hands moving like blurs as the winch hummed and strained. Slowly, painstakingly, the harness reached the doorway of the helicopter. Grab him! Emily shouted. Two technicians lunged forward, gripping Chris's harness and pulling him and Jacob inside. Chris gasped as he collapsed onto the floor, his face slick with rain and sweat. Jacob's limp body followed, landing gently in the hands of the rescuers. He's hypothermic. Chris shouted as he unbuckled himself and knelt beside Jacob. Get the blankets on him now. Emily grabbed an emergency thermal blanket and wrapped it tightly around Jacob's trembling form. His face was pale, his lips a bluish hue, and his eyes fluttered faintly. Jacob, can you hear me? Emily said softly, leaning close so he could hear her over the noise of the helicopter. Jacob's eyelids flickered. He turned his head slightly, his cracked lips parting. You came, he rasped, barely above a whisper. Emily smiled, tears blurring her vision. Yeah, we came. You're safe now. The helicopter rose higher, leaving Dead Man's Ridge behind as it cut a path through the storm. Roger flew with grim determination, the worst of the winds beginning to abate as they descended toward the nearest hospital. Inside the cabin, the rescue crew worked urgently to stabilize Jacob's condition, monitoring his vitals and rubbing warmth back into his freezing limbs. Emily sat beside him, holding his hand gently. For all his wealth and power, Jacob Maxwell looked so small in that moment, just a man who had fought to survive against impossible odds. She couldn't stop thinking about how close he had come to being ignored. If she hadn't pushed for this mission, if she hadn't discovered his identity, Jacob Maxwell might still be on that ridge, alone and forgotten. How many others are left behind? The question weighed heavily on her as she watched him breathe faintly beneath the blanket. Hours later, the helicopter touched down at the regional hospital. A team of paramedics rushed forward, transferring Jacob to a waiting stretcher and wheeling him inside. As the double doors swung closed, Emily stood beside the helicopter, rain still dripping from her hair as she exhaled deeply. Roger clapped a hand on her shoulder. You did good, Emily. We got him out. Emily nodded, her heart still pounding. Yeah, we did. But she knew the story wasn't over. Somewhere out there, a conversation needed to be had. Decisions had been made, decisions that almost cost a man his life. And as much as the world celebrated Jacob Maxwell's survival, Emily couldn't help but wonder what might have happened if his name hadn't carried weight. If he had been just another man, just another distress signal in a storm, would anyone have come? The aftermath and a reckoning. Jacob woke to the sterile hum of hospital machines. His body felt heavy, as though each limb were weighed down by anchors, but the warmth of the blankets wrapped around him and the faint beeping of the heart monitor reminded him he was alive. He blinked slowly, taking in his surroundings, a private hospital room bathed in soft light, the sound of rain still pattering faintly against the window. Alive. The word echoed in his mind, a quiet but profound realization. The memories of the mountain returned in fragmented pieces, the storm, the cold, the darkness swallowing him whole. And then the rescue, the helicopter spotlight, strong hands pulling him from the ridge, and the voice, "You're safe now." He exhaled deeply, his chest rising and falling with effort as though even breathing felt like work. The door creaked open, and a nurse entered, a kind-looking woman in scrubs carrying a tablet. "Good to see you awake, Mr. Maxwell," she said with a smile, adjusting the drip at his side. "You gave everyone quite the scare. How are you feeling?" Jacob's voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Alive. I feel alive." "That's what matters," she replied warmly. "You're lucky the rescue team found you when they did." Jacob's brow furrowed slightly. "The rescue," he murmured, memories surfacing slowly. He wanted to ask about the team, about the woman who had been there in the helicopter, holding his hand, her voice calm in the chaos. As if on cue, the door opened again, and Emily Harding entered the room, her face lighting up with relief when she saw him awake. She looked different without the rain and wind whipping at her, her blonde hair tied back neatly, her expression calm but carrying the faintest trace of guilt. "Mr. Maxwell," she said softly, approaching the bed. "It's good to see you awake." Jacob turned his head toward her, his eyes studying her carefully. You were there," he said, his voice still weak but steady. "The storm. You found me." Emily nodded, offering a small smile. "Yes, I was part of the rescue team. My name's Emily Harding. We got to you just in time." Jacob's gaze lingered on her for a moment. "You saved my life." "It was a team effort," Emily said quickly. "The pilot, the crew, we all worked together." Jacob's eyes narrowed slightly. "But you're the one who pushed for it, aren't you?" He didn't ask the question as much as state it, as though the truth had already revealed itself. Emily hesitated, unsure how much to say. Finally, she nodded. "Yes, I did." "Why?" Jacob pressed, his voice stronger now. "Why would you need to push for a rescue?" Emily swallowed hard, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her jacket. "Because," she paused, choosing her words carefully. "Because it wasn't an easy call. The storm was dangerous, and there were doubts. About whether anyone would survive out there. About whether it was worth the risk." Jacob's jaw clenched. Doubts. He could hear the hesitation in her voice, the careful attempt not to say what she really meant. They hadn't thought he was worth saving. Not until they knew his name. "Tell me the truth," Jacob said quietly, his dark eyes meeting hers. "If my name wasn't Jacob Maxwell, would you have come for me?" The question hit Emily like a punch. She looked away, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I don't know if the decision would have been the same. I wish I could say it didn't matter, but it did." Silence filled the room like a heavy fog. Jacob stared at the ceiling, his mind reeling. He had always known, deep down, that wealth and status gave him privileges others didn't have. He had fought tooth and nail to earn his place in the world, but the unspoken truth was that the world still judged him differently. Without the weight of his name, he might have been left on that ridge to die. "Thank you for saving me," Jacob said finally, his voice soft but resolute. "But we need to talk about this. Because I won't let this happen to someone else." Over the next few days, Jacob's strength returned. Doctors marveled at his resilience, crediting his survival to both his physical fitness and the sheer determination that had driven him to hold on long enough for the rescue team to arrive. News of his ordeal spread quickly, capturing headlines and igniting conversations around the world. Billionaire tech mogul rescued from deadly storm. But behind the headlines, Jacob was grappling with the darker truths of his experience. He couldn't stop thinking about what had nearly happened, the delay in his rescue, the hesitation, the questions of worth. If it had taken that much effort to save him, what about people who didn't have his resources, his name, his visibility? He remembered the moments in his life when he had been dismissed, doubted, overlooked. This was no different, it was just more deadly. A week later, Jacob called for a press conference. The room was filled with reporters, cameras flashing, the hum of curiosity filling the air. Everyone expected him to recount the details of his survival, to talk about gratitude and overcoming the odds. But Jacob had other plans. Dressed in a sharp but simple suit, he stepped to the podium, his gaze steady and commanding. "First, I want to thank the brave men and women who risked their lives to save me," Jacob began, his voice calm but powerful. "Without them, I wouldn't be standing here today." He paused, letting the room settle. "But this isn't just my story. It's a wake-up call. I survived because I'm Jacob Maxwell, a name that carries weight. And that's the problem. In those critical hours, my life shouldn't have been determined by who I am, how much money I have, or what I've achieved. It should have been determined by the simple fact that I'm human." A murmur rippled through the crowd as Jacob continued. There are people every day who face crises just as dire as mine, people whose calls for help are ignored because they don't fit the profile. People who are left behind because of their circumstances, their backgrounds, or the color of their skin. I can't ignore that truth, and neither should you. He paused again, his gaze sweeping the room. So, I'm starting the Beacon Initiative, a foundation dedicated to improving emergency response systems, ensuring that no one is overlooked or dismissed. We will invest in technology, training, and accountability to ensure that when someone calls for help, help comes. No questions asked. The room erupted in applause as Jacob stepped back, his message delivered. He knew it wouldn't change the world overnight, but it was a start. Later that evening, as Jacob stood by the window of his penthouse, watching the city lights glitter below, he felt a sense of purpose unlike any he had felt before. Surviving the mountain had taught him something. His life wasn't just about his achievements. It was about the impact he could make. In the end, the storm had done more than test his strength, it had revealed a deeper truth about the world he lived in. And Jacob Maxwell, the man who had spent his life fighting for respect, was ready to fight for others. In the stillness of the night, he whispered to himself, "No one gets left behind." And this time, he meant it.